Oh, hello. Um, what shall we do now? Okay, so yeah, this is probably going to be one of the last ones on the tutorial series for tunnels. And in fact, I wanted to branch a little bit into Carrara and just show you kind of how I did um, some of these animations, right? I mean, you see some of the renderings here that we seem to be diving into some sort of a scaffolding or a structure that's repetitive, and that always makes for great material to use. And I wanted to show a couple of things. Typically what I would do is model this in the vertex modeler, perhaps give it some sharp edges, or in this case it's smoothed. And what I'd like to do is repeat it a few times and then move the camera through that. So, rotate it like this and move the camera into it. And so one thing I'll do is, first of all, move the position here on the transform, make sure that the hot point is in the center of the object, and then that makes it a little bit easier to manipulate, and predictably manipulate, that is. And then I'll just make some duplicates. Now I'll do Control D to make one duplicate, and then I'll move it. And sometimes you'll need that exact touch position here. So one thing to actually use is the collision detection under the View menu. You can see show product. That's another one, the product frame, the production frame, but that's not quite needed yet. What we need is the collision detection. That will be very useful. So when we have one item, we can have it rendered, Control D, have it positioned so that it goes and stops there the moment it touches. Now it doesn't touch in this area. These are not all the same depths, but the moment it has one, it will stop. Now if you don't want that, if you want to actually have them all overlap and really kind of go seamless, so to speak, or without a gap, that is, what you'll do is actually get rid of that collision detection and then just adjust it until you have the right position. And you might need to work on several views at the same time, like give it about 4 views here, so you can zoom in and move one from this view, zoom in here this one, and position that one the way you want it as well. And then soon enough you have that 2 levels already, and you do another repeat over here and another one, and so maybe you need about 10 or 8 or so levels. And now we can see here in the perspective view what that looks like. Now I'm going to group them all together so I don't accidentally move one against the other, although that could be an interesting scenario too. What I'm going to do is, let's say if I select the vertex objects here, they're all in there. I don't need the light in there, so let's drag that out and simply close that so the vertex object can be manipulated as one item. And so there it is. Here's kind of an interesting tunnel, and what I wanted to do is just show how to render that so that you do have the gaps here showing as transparency in a PNG file sequence, for instance, right? How do you set that so that you can then import that in Dogwaffle, for instance, as in Howler as a PNG with transparency there. So in Carrara you can do that quite nicely. There is first of all, you're going to need to set the animation, so and perhaps also the materials. I'll just use the default material here, it's not so important, but that certainly can add a lot more great feeling to the entire scene. So let's go and animate it from here all the way to the end. That's going to be just 4 seconds long, and maybe we need some extra frames. It's better to have more than too many than too few, so let's give it 60 frames a second and move in here to about this place. There you go. And perhaps also adjust a little bit the position, keep it symmetric as much as possible, centered, perhaps even rotate a little bit. So you could change the angle. Where is it? There, something like this, so it kind of turns as we're going through that, right? So here's a look at the animation. If I play it like this, there you go. And so what I need to do now is to render that frame by frame, and I'm going to go to the rendering with output going to let's keep it a little bit you know, you could do 512, why not? Let's be done quickly here, just for the sake of the demo. 512 by 512, and we'll save it not to an AVI file, because that would not support, in most cases AVI will not support the alpha channel as a transparency mask, although that varies. It depends on the codec you use. But what I'd like to do is really have it as a movie in a JPEG or PNG. There, let's use a PNG format, and Targa would work too. And we'll have the full 4 seconds at 60 frames a second. We'll have a render alpha channel as well. If you want, if you feel like it, you could have it pre-multiplied alpha. We can probably cover that later on. It's all against black background, not too bad. PNG, we may want to verify some plugin options down here. And there's actually nothing here to worry about. Nothing shows up. There are, however, some additional options you might want to do, perhaps for multipass. In addition to the rendering that will have alpha, maybe you want another image sequence that also just shows maybe the name of the object. So you'll see the background will be object 0, and then the first of those objects in my scene will be object 1, number 2, number 3, and so on. They'll appear in different color or gray levels. So that could be a way to use it. I think the depth will be very nice too, because with the depth you can use maybe do a blurring based on the distance, and that's really what I wanted to do in this tutorial. So let's do that. Let's use the depth and have that as the additional information saved out. Back on the rendering, what I'll do is let's see, let's go fast. We don't need to have it the highest quality because it's going to move fast, plus I don't want it to last too long. Let's go with, let's see what else. So this one's against black background. You know what, let's change it to white background. So because right now it looks like this, and let's make it white background. So let's go to the scene, there it is, and set the backdrop, actually the backdrop, to a plain color, and that color will be right here, plain white. Okay, the background you could also set to a color like white or maybe a gradient, and that's particularly useful if you decide to give it a bit better lighting. So you could do the background, let's say for instance a gradient, where it's in the middle along the horizon, it might be white. Right, so you give it white like this, but on the sky at the top it's blue, at the bottom it's kind of a dark brown. And that might be particularly interesting if you want to actually render it in such a way that it's using the skylight, right? If you enable the skylight, then you'll get a little bit of lighting effects, a bit sort of a bluish tint, because the upper part of the sky is blue and the lower part is a bit more earth colors or dark. But that takes a lot of additional time, as you saw. If I do the ambient occlusion, it might go a little bit faster. Let's see. Oh, I need indirect light for that. That's not the skylight. So that's ambient occlusion. That's a different effect. And certainly there's plenty to explore just to see what we can do there to make it even more interesting looking. So this one here might be another one. I'm not going to focus so much on that right now. All I want to do is have a sequence that's quickly rendered, and I think we can just use that. We might want to control the size of the tiles when we do the rendering nodes, the tile size rather here. So if we have a lot of small detail, it's nice to bring that down a little bit. And let's see what that does. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, so we have the images being rendered. Because of the alpha channel, though, it looks like it's black here. It's really just not rendering it. It's showing it masked off. And you can tell there's a little bit of a white glow. That's the anti-aliased edges. There's one more thing we need to do. So one more thing we need to do, and that's, where was that? Oh yeah, we need to say where we want those images. So we have a PNG image sequence. We need to tell it where that's going to go. By default, it's going to have some sort of a default location where Carrara saves everything. But I'm going to name that file. So I'm going to actually go to my D drive, and save that where I want that animation to be rendered and saved in the end. So let's see, potpourri, there it is. Tunnels, Carrara 2. I'm now going to do create another folder. Tunnels, Carrara 3, and that's not how you spell Carrara. There's an A missing. There you go. And go in here, and this is kind of ovals. I'm not sure what it is. Let's give it ovals. Okay, it's going to go to PNGs, register. So we now have a clear definition of where these images are going to go, and that's really good because you don't want to waste your time trying to look for that later on. All right, so let's go and render that. So this goes pretty quick. It is multipass, meaning it also saves the transparency mask by itself. The final images are going to look great with the white background, but we will have something like this where the mask is also available as a separate image sequence. And the reason I wanted to show that is that we can actually use that in Dog Waffle in a couple of ways. The mask can actually be loaded as an image sequence, or we can turn it into a DWA file or an AVI file, and at that point designate it as an animated selection mask. So be prepared to use that, for instance, to then say frame for frame as we navigate through the animation, as we play through the animation, to also see a selection mask evolving with it. And therefore, for every frame of the animation, we're going to be free to do stuff that's either affecting only the structure here or only the background, depending on whether we invert it. For instance, we might want to blur what's in the background so that the background doesn't appear so crisp. And that's typically a trick you use to just make it look like it's farther away. You might want to make it darker, you might want to add some bluish tone to it so it looks cooler. That's usually also associated with something farther away. Dark and blue feels like it's not something that our retina can record so quickly, whereas when it's bright and red, it feels warm, it feels closer. And that's some of the tricks you can play to give it a bit more of perspective. Now that's not geometric perspective where things are smaller based on the distance. It's more of a tonal perspective or hue. And so here you see the animation we've created. One of them, this is probably just, these are the depth information. And then we have the actual, the ovals, the actual shaded rendering right there. Alright, so that's done. And so now I'm going to switch over to Dog Waffle, and let's have a look at some of these. First of all, let's have a look at what the animations look like when we import those. If we import them as a single image, one by one, let's say go open and just load the image right here. Now where did I save that? Tunnels. Oh, that's not in Tunnels 2. We need to go up one level. There it is. There. Alright, no, not Carrara 1, Carrara 3, there it is, that's the one. Alright, so in here we do have this animation. It's PNGs. Windows likes that. It can see it can generate the icons for you, and that's great because then that way you can kind of get a better orientation of what you want to select. And you can also use control scroll bar to zoom in a little bit to make it a little bit bigger on those thumb wheels or on those thumbnails. And so here, for instance, let's open one of them. Let's open this one here. So when I open this one as a PNG file, it also loads the alpha channel if it has one. Now it doesn't show it by default, but you can go to the selection menu here and enable the alpha. And now you should see the marching ants. Right now, sometimes it's a bit difficult to see them because of the noise the picture itself might have. So I recommend also showing two other ways that you can see the selection mask. One is the overlay alpha, and wherever it turns pink, that's where the selection is off. Wherever the original color is still showing, that's where the selection is full. And then you'll see any sort of gradation in between. Or one thing you can do also is store the alpha. Just like we can store the image, like here, store image copy, you have just the RGB channels. Actually, no, you also have the alpha channel select or stored. It just doesn't show here. But you can actually see that it has the replace alpha, therefore it had stored it. But independently of that, the image you have here also has the alpha channel showing, and one thing you can do is go to the selection menu and store that alpha. So that way you actually see what the alpha channel contains. That's the image representation of what's in the alpha channel. And it's a grayscale image, 256 color values from black to white, any grays in between. And so that's the selection mask we're talking about for this one image. Of course, you're not going to load one by one all of them. You want to load the whole image sequence. Now, in the case of loading this image as an animation, we will not load the alpha channel. It's going to get the RGB values, but that's it. For the animation sequence, we don't have an alpha on each frame. However, we can still make it look like we have a selection mask that's varying and changing with the animation frame by frame. And the thing to do is to actually split them in two. And we did that already. We have a rendered sequence of the images. And even though it has the alpha, we're not going to use it. But we also have the image, the sequence of the depth. That depth information is another one we can use as well. So let's have a look at what that looks like before we start putting it all together. If I open here, here's an example of the depth, oval's depth, right? Open that. And so now we have something where white represents the far distance. That's the high depth. And then the darker it is, the closer it is. That's the black parts really close, and then the farther away, the brighter they get. And suddenly they jump to full white. Here also they jump to full white because we have a gap where we see the background. So that said, you can use that as depth information. Right, so you could use it, for instance, to say blur it, or to do anything, show another image behind it, or do a variety of things. Heck, you could use that as an elevation map, or maybe invert it first, invert it like this, and then put it into ray tracer, like transform, puppy ray, and so now you have a elevation map rendering of this, right? So you maybe with some global illumination there. And you can see that you have an interesting display of that geometry. Based on the brightness, it changes the elevation. And the quality here, you can do a final render. Of course, there are some staircasing here happening because it's a limited 8-bit depth gray value. You might want to change a couple of things, like for instance the pre-filter. If you reduce it, it's going to be crisp. That's why you'll see a very crisp transition on all of these. But if you increase it to the max, it's going to do a little bit of smoothing, and it's going to give you a nice smooth surface there. All right, so that's that. That's some of the things you can do with the elevation map. Of course, that's not what we want to do in this case. What we want to do is load the whole sequence. So let's go to the animation menu and load the sequence. And the first sequence is going to be the one, let's see, where's my PC? Right here. Go to the D drive, find my daily dose, and locate the potpourri. There it is. Locate Carrara 3. So we have PNG files. Now we have both the depth information as well as the actual shaded renderings. And the shaded renderings have an alpha mask, the selection mask, but we're not going to use that. We're going to use the depth information. So we could actually do a couple of things. In this case, I'm going to first load the colors. So this is actually, you can pretty much scroll to the middle where it splits. There it is. So we have this sequence here starting here. First frame. Let's just grab a few to test it first. Load the selection, and so we now have this. All right. So we have. You can see we have a little animation here of just about a dozen frames, and we typically don't have the alpha channel on that. So even if we show alpha on. You see the marching ants, but it's only all around it. The whole image is selected because even though the images do contain alpha, we ignore it when we load it into the animation. Alright, so that said, let's go to actually load that entire sequence. Load sequence again. From here, scroll down to the bottom and make sure we end at the last one. That's 239. Right, so the first one being 0, the last one 239, we have a total of 240 frames. Now we rendered those over 4 seconds at 60 frames per second. 4 times 60 is indeed 240. So it all adds up. Let's go and load this selected. And so now we have this animation coming in. Takes a couple of seconds to load. And once it's loaded, it's still in the process of loading, I think, right now here. Yep, now that it's loaded, we certainly want to store that. Let's store this animation to disk, so it's not going to take too much memory in RAM, precious memory, and we now have an animation stored. Now that's not the mask, that's the actual shaded part. The next thing you want to do is do the same thing with the mask that represents the distance. Alright, so I'm going to go to animation, load sequence, same thing. And this time I'm scrolling up to the top and taking the depth part. So I'm going to load something like this here. Boop, boop, there you go. So here's the depth information, another 240 frames. Let's go load that. And here they are. And so now we have, that one will store also. Store that to disk, and almost done. There you go. So now we have an animation here representing the depth information as it changes over time, and we have this one representing the colors we want to actually see. Now we may want to change some of these. For instance, this one here, we might want to have it a little bit more on the reddish tone, especially when it gets closer, and dark blue when it's far away. We need to apply some sort of coloring to that, and it might be done, for instance, with a gradient, a circular gradient that goes from blue to reddish. Right, so that's a fairly easy trick to apply. We can do that with a brush containing that gradient, and then just render it through the brush keyframer. That would be one way to do that. Let's try that. Okay, let's go and temporarily clear this first image here. Let's go clear it. Right, and let's draw a gradient that is kind of dark blue in the middle and goes into kind of a reddish, more saturated red towards the edges. Now we have a right click here on this tool below the curve tool, or before the text tool. There's this tool here that has all sorts of special effects and lens flares and nova options, and also a couple of gradient related tools, including the circular gradient. So when you use that, when you use the circular gradient, you can draw here and apply the current gradient, which in this case goes from black to white. Now I need a different gradient, so I'm going to go to the window menu here and select sweep editor. I like that one for the gradient, and I'm going to change the gradient. You have some presets here, maybe those will work, right? Or maybe you can click here on this little icon here to load a different one. There are some great gunmetals and rainbows. Let's have a look at the rainbows. There you go, blue, red to blue, going through some greens. There are others. You know, some of them really exciting, really cool. What I'm going to do is use this one. It's not exactly the reddish tint, but it's just to prove the point you can do what you want to do there. So when you apply that, now you have a gradient that goes like this. Maybe you want to invert it, so switch this here, so now it's going from purple to kind of a reddish tint. Perfect. Look at that. Alright, so we need that, and we need it to not stay green on the edge, kind of fade away in intensity at the end. So we need the transparency on that gradient to kind of fade away on the green end. Right, so what we do is we go to the opacity tab here and change the opacity so it kind of drops down to fully transparent. No opacity means fully transparent. Then we can blur it a little bit, press and hold this little blur tool here, and so now we have a nice little smooth transition. So now we can actually do the gradient here. See how it's no longer finishing it green all over? So let's go erase this and do something like that. And so in other words, this is now a perfect image that we can use in a multiply mode. It's going to tint it. If we multiply by red, everything gets red. If we multiply by dark purple, everything turns purple. If we multiply by white, it doesn't change. It's not an additive, it's a multiply operation, right? So what we'll need to do is pick this up as a custom brush. Let's go do that, for instance, with this tool here, the custom brush selection tool, and grab the portion we want, just well outside the white area, something like this, something like that. Alright, so we can hit the preview here to see it, and it looks like it's opaque on the white, and it sure is, but we will we'll use it in multiply mode, therefore it doesn't matter. If we look at the opacity, we can make it fully opaque. There it is. And what we'll now do is store that. Actually, we'll also use the mode here as multiply. Although at this point, it doesn't really matter yet. Now we can paint here. You see it's not replacing the white edge. This is the multiply mode. Alright, so what we'll do now is put this animation back in. Click here. Right, that's why we stored it, so we can quickly load it again and keep working with it. And then the stored brush, we need to store it still. Here's the stored brush. And we'll now put that into good use with the brush keyframer. And in the brush keyframer, we'll see our animation back here, and the brush put right in front of it. Okay. And so now the opaque mode hides this because it's white and it's opaque. So in opaque mode, that's no good. We need to make it a different mode. Try subtract. That looks interesting, but it's not what we want. Try multiply. There you go. Now you see how it's turning kind of a greenish, reddish tint going into purple and going dark. In the middle it's black, so it's going to be very dark there too. And so what I'll do is perhaps move this brush. You know, it's the brush is right here. We can move it right there. We can change the scale. And that's a quick way to give it more blue or more red or more nothing, right? Just leave it alone. That's sometimes the best way to deal with things. And I'm becoming a little bit of a philosopher here now. But let's go put it right around here. And so now in this animation, what you'll see is that things will be appearing to get their original grayish tint when they are very close. But as they are farther away, they kind of turn reddish. And then as they are even farther away, they are showing kind of a purple tone and so on. So that's an interesting little trick you can use. You see how it's moving, and it just keeps, it's not attached to the object, it seems to be attached to the distance. It's not really attached to the distance, just that we have a gradient being multiplied to it. Alright, let's go render that. And now we have an animation we'll want to work with in combination with the other animation. Let's go see what that looks like. I don't need this preview anymore of the brush. So we have now this animation with the colors added to it. And we now need to combine it so we can actually see through those areas here, kind of do a combination or a selection mask of some sorts. So one thing we'll do, we'll use the trick we used in the past. It was similar to green or blue screen compositing. It was actually black. Sometimes we use the black screen, so we can use that because we have some dark areas, but they're not totally black. They're kind of a dark gray. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, store this, because if I mess it up, I want to be able to reuse it. Let's go to disk. And there it is. So we have this animation. This one we probably don't need anymore, but just to be safe, we'll keep it around. We could minimize it or just make it a bit smaller. And so now, what I'd like to do is actually put a background behind it. We have a total of 240 frames. We need some sort of an animated background. Like, you know, oh, how about that other one that was also an animation that I did in Carrara with the, oh wait, that was a different format. I'm not sure if I can use that as is. Yeah, probably can. You know, let's just give it a try. Load sequence. Let's see. So up to Carrara 2. Here were the PSDs. I don't know if I can save, load those into an animation though. So let's see. Oh, I have BMP versions here. Let's take a look at that. Yeah, these were bigger too. They weren't 512 by 512. That was okay. So we would need to make that a little bit smaller, like half the size. Okay, so here's the animation, and I don't know if I can load that 240 times. Maybe I can. What's 240 times a megabyte? Because if it's 1024 by 1024, that's a million pixels. A megabyte times 4 probably RGB in memory, even, and plus alpha. Even though if we don't store alpha, we probably allocate it. So it would be 4 times 4 megabytes per frame, 240. Yeah, you know what? We should be able to handle that. In fact, let's do a test here. Let's do create an animation of 240 frames. And it tells us we need roughly 740 megabytes. Bingo, we should be able to do that. All right, so here's what it looks like when we actually make it so. And nothing to it really. Now what we'll do is actually load the image sequence into that whole thing, or load a new image sequence rather. So load image sequence, and we'll go from frame 0. No, actually we had more. We had 273 frames. So minus 240, that's 33. Let's start at number 33. That might not be inside the structure yet, but it doesn't matter. We'll be 33. Let's start with a few before that. We can always delete a few. All right, let's go and load that selected. So now we're loading 240 frames that are all BMP files. We'll convert them into the we'll load them into the image sequence, and we will have something we can use. There you go. Here's the animation of that structure, and we can use that as the background. Doesn't look too good, but oh well, we'll use that. Maybe we'll do a couple of more coloring tricks, or you know what? Let's make it shorter and then make it longer again. Here, let's do a little trick here. We don't want this part, so I'll just start from about here. Let's cut that out. I make this the out point and then go back to the beginning and make that the in point. So that's the marker tricks, right? You have an in marker and the out marker somewhere here. In blue you see the whole selection. Right click on that, delete this block. Right, so all these frames are being deleted now. We're going to be left with far fewer than 240 frames. In the end we'll just time stretch it, or use the motion interpolation motion prediction module. One thing we also need to do is make this smaller. So what's the current dimensions? I think it's 1024. Let's see, image info here. Yeah, 1024 squared. So I'm going to make it half that dimension. Resample it and click half. 512 by 512. Now if I wanted best quality, I'll leave it by cubic, but I'm in a hurry, so I'm going to go nearest neighbor and do that. So now we have far less memory used by that, and we only have 142 frames here. We might want to actually bring it back up with time stretch. Let's do that the cheap way. Right click, time stretch, and say we want a total 240 frames, and we want frame blending with that. All right, so here we go. We now have 240 frames. Let's clear the alpha. I don't know why we got an alpha on that. Now this is a little bit dark. Maybe we want to invert that. Let's see, invert. Oh, that looks interesting. A bit more bluish perhaps. Let's go add some filter to that. Filter, adjust color. Let's see, let's add let's reduce the red, and so it takes a little bluish tint, and that would be the multiply mode. Let's see what additive can do. Perhaps a little bit better there. It looks a little bit more glassy. Classy or glassy, I don't know, you pick. Let's go animate that all across the animation and apply that filter there, and then the next thing we'll do is perhaps adjust the dynamic range so we have some brighter parts again, and perhaps do a little bit of glow. I don't know, this is really where you just can play and experiment and find some beautiful results. Photographic filter, soft contrast improvement, that one is quite often really surprisingly interesting at the end here. Let's see. Okay, animate that all across. Alright, so we have an animation, and we will use this as our background. So store animation, animation, store animation to disk. There you go. Alright, so this brush we probably won't need anymore. This is our animation we want in the background. This is the animation containing the structure we want in the foreground. So what we will do is this one here we will designate as the animated swap image. Bingo, done. This one here we will load. That's our current animation. Alright, how do we combine the two? Well, you can preview it here. You can see that both are indeed being used in an animated way, but most importantly, you can do a compositing between the two. Now, you could do that compositing in a couple of ways. One is to simply say, wherever it's really black, really dark, I want to see not this black pixel, I want to see what's behind it in this animated swap image. That's exactly what that's doing. So remember that, filter, composite with swap, color key. Right? So pick the black pixels, there you go, you see the colors showing. Now it's too much tolerance, so it also bleeds into some other parts here, because we have some dark parts here. Make sure you stay on the black and then adjust the high clip and the low clip, so it's really not giving it much tolerance, and the only thing it can actually make transparent is the black background. Right? And you can see the matte right there. That looks good, and it's animated. Click on animate and it will apply that all across the entire animation. And so now you have this animation. I just did that. And the next thing I want to do is say, okay, this animation looks great, but the background needs to be blurry. Right? So now we're going to do this combination with the selection mask, where we can also then apply a blurring filter on that selection. It will only apply through the sky, through the background holes. So let's first store this animation. That's so great. Thank you, Dan, for adding that feature. That's such a great feature now that we have the ability to store the animation again and again automatically on disk. Doesn't have to ask us where to save it and so on. It's just awesome for your workflow. So now we have this animation, and we do want to have this here, that's the selection. Actually, no, this one here. That represents the distance, not the selection, but the distance. But it turns out to be about the same thing, at least in the front here. Whenever it's white, that part is essentially selecting the background. Dark selects anything off the structure. And as we blend towards the end here, it kind of goes into a mush. Right? So here it's all the background too, but there's sort of a transition based on distance, and that means it's not all or nothing. There's kind of a transition where the blurring will gradually take over as we apply it, and that's a great thing to have right there. So how do we make this the current selection? Right? How do we turn this into not the animated swap, but the animated selection? We could have it if we saved it out to an AVI file or to a dog waffle animation, a DWA. You could go to the animation menu and animate the selections, pick it right there. But we're lazy, we don't like to save stuff on files. So instead we have this button here, use as animated selection. Click on that, and now as you scrub through that, you can tell that there is a selection mask. You see those marching ants? They're not marching anymore, they're too lazy now. But you can see that they're there, and in fact you can also enable the overlay. That's actually, I had it already on, so you can turn the overlay on, and just to see it I wouldn't necessarily leave it there, but what you can see is that it's making this selection update. It's updating the selection as a function of the frames that are throughout here in the entire animation, the stored animation. So that's perfect. Now we have a selection that we can use in parallel to the actual animation, and it matches. So what do we do with that selection? Well, whatever you want to do. You have some pixels selected. What do you want to do with it? For instance, do you want to apply a blurring effect to it? So for instance, you go to the filter menu and apply blur, such as the Gaussian blur. And with the Gaussian blur, you can do even a side-by-side, so you see some of it blurred and some of it you don't. See how it's blurring the right side here? But it's only blurring it on the background through the selection. And then this one here, the foreground, is not blurred. This here on the left is not blurred because we are in side-by-side mode. Here you see it blurred all over, but again only through the selection. Now look at what happens here in the middle. The selection is actually progressive. It's not all or nothing, right? It has a kind of a whitish tone in the middle, but let me cancel out of that temporarily. You see how it's gradually going into the fully selected center. And so in terms of applying a blur, that means it's not blurring and then gradually blurring more and more, and eventually is fully blurred. So if you zoom in here, you can see that. I'm going to now apply that filter. Blur. Maybe we'll use the bokeh blur. That's a really nice one too. and you can see how it's kind of blurry here, but then gradually the blur disappears, and you can adjust how much of that blur you want, adjust the bias, adjust do that right there. There's great tools here. Play with those and enjoy. We are certainly happy to have that, and we are proud to have that functionality there. One thing we'll do, let's see, alpha affects the size. So the size of the bokeh blur retina, so to speak, is going to be affected by how intense that alpha selection is. And you have some other effects that you can get there. And now let's apply that over the entire. Let's make it not too much blurry. There you go. And apply through the entire animation. So our main object is still nicely crisp. The background is somewhat blurry, and there is a transition where it's also doing that along the structure in the distance. But when it's close enough, it's not blurring it. And that's what that's all about. And so now, almost done. Let me zoom back out. Actually, let me click here to zoom it to 100%. There you go. Now we'll uncheck this use as animated selection and clear the selection so we don't have any left over. And so here we go. Here we just have done this beautiful tunnel with 3D that's crisp in the foreground and background that's blurry from another 3D animation in Carrara. And that's really putting it nicely together. So, I mean, there are so many other things you can do here. Let's do one more. Okay, I'm going to add. Let's stop the animation here. First of all, store that, right? And I should actually save it to file. But we tend to get lazy and not do that all the time. So let's go and apply this one more time. Use it one more time as a selection mask. And go, there you go. So now this time let's do something else. Let's say we have some snowfall. So we're going to have snowfall appear through these gaps, but only on the outside. So with that, I'll take the timeline from the animation toolbar, and we have some snowfall here somewhere. At the very end, there's some animated purlin noise. That would look interesting too. And you can see how the purlin noise kind of vanishes towards the end. It kind of gradually blends there. You could do, let's see, ghosting. You could do, let's see, snowfall. There it is. So let's do the snowfall, and what you'll see is that the preview is showing the snow right there, but only through the gaps where the alpha, the selection mask, allows it, right? That's exactly what we're talking about. Now what I'm going to do is have a lot of that snowfall and make sure it goes kind of like a blizzard sideways. So the wind speed needs to be high. The velocity that controls how fast it goes downwards need to be low. And then perhaps let's make it a little bit smaller also. Have a lot of it. Small. It could be dark, could be bright, less turbulent, and render. Apply that. Make sure you have the save undo enabled, so if you don't like it, you can undo that. So now check this out. Now we have almost done. There you go. So now we have a snowfall, sort of a blizzard in the distance. Here it is enabled. You can see through. But over here you don't. Here you only see it in the background. So it seems like at the farther distance it's coming through. Now I may not like how it's actually gradually showing here. I may want it to really only show through that opening. Maybe we need to adjust the alpha, make it a bit more high contrast alpha, right? Because if I store this alpha, check what that looks like. Selecting store alpha, there is this transition here, right? It is not just all white or all black. It's got a gray transition. And I mean, some of the snowflakes are starting to show, even though we are still looking at the structure, not at the background. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. So we don't want that. Okay, let's not do that. Instead, let's adjust the alpha with higher contrast. Now, this is something you'll have to do perhaps on the animation before you load it. Here, we're just using what the stored animation is, right? This one here, we can't go and modify it at here. We would actually need to work with that in order to then apply a version that has higher contrast. Okay, so let's go do that. Let's go clear the animation. Let's not use this as animated selection. Let's go clear the selection or the alpha, and then click on that to actually replace the animation right there. And now what we need to do is increase the contrast. Right now, the contrast, this is the black and white or the grayscale rendering of what will ultimately become the selection mask. We can certainly go into, for instance, here, the animation, and say in the timeline, adjust value and increase the contrast. There's the contrast, increase the contrast. So you can see how this can be used so that it really doesn't show any of the structure until the very end where you have a gap, the whole opening at the end. Perhaps increase the gamma. You want to make sure you don't start dark on the edges here. That opening should remain white. There you go. So that's a high contrast now. Something like that. So that's a high contrast. It's a fully enabled mask or a fully disabled non-selection. There's nothing in between. Or barely. I mean, a tiny little bit perhaps, right? Make it even more perfect. There you go. Okay, so with that, let's go apply that and store that under the animation menu, store to disk. And so now we have a selection mask that is much more high contrast, much more discriminating. This one here had a lot of transition to gray through the different gray values. Don't need this one. This is the one we want. Let's make this one use as animated selection. Let's click that. So now we actually have an animated selection, and we can go back to our other animation, which I hope I saved. Yep, there it is. Click that. Okay, and we have everything in sync, and we can now apply the snowfall again. Let's go to animated snowfall. Where is it? Snowfall, there it is. You can see the snowfall, and it's now going to be much more contained inside the parts that are indeed supposed to be seen here. There's still a little bit of a transition. It's not I didn't tighten it all the way, but you can see how that works. And I'm going to give it a lot of wind speed to the right, very little velocity, so it's kind of only going sideways, very little turbulence, small snowflakes, and high brightness, not too bright. And you know, you don't give it too many snowfall, too much like the snowflakes count here, the amount of snowfall. Don't give it too much. You can always re-render that a few times. Now here's something that looks really strange. There's a little bit of a side effect when you actually render it. The alpha is kind of cumulative there, or it's leaving some trails, but that's only during the rendering process. So once you've actually done that, you're good, and you can play it, and you can see a little bit of snowfall happening. Again, it's not a lot of snowfall because I didn't have the snowfall amount, too many of them. Let's just render it again, apply it a few more times. And each time you do that, it will add more snowfall. Let's make it 2 or 3 more times. And by the way, if you don't like this, you know, this strange effect here with the trails, you can simply disable the marching ants. You can show here under selection that even though you keep the alpha on, but you don't have to see the marching ants. Right, so you make sure the alpha is actually enabled, otherwise it's not going to use it. But at least, even though you don't see the marching ants, it's actually doing this animation through the alpha mask. And so you can see every time that there is another rendering, you'll see a few more snowflakes. Boom, there they were. Maybe you change the size also. Maybe you have even more of those, but at bigger size, and apply one more time. So now we have very high intensity snowfall here, blizzard, and that will basically complete this tutorial. We have tunnels all over now. We can combine them with 3D renderings from Carrara, and there's probably just one last thing we'll want to do at the very end, and that's perhaps to add a little bit of a text, or I don't know, something that will just come in. And what I'll do, let's go and store that animation. There you go. And I'll be very daring here. I'll assume this is good and I don't need anything else. So I'm going to delete a few of the other resources to declutter all that. And I know I'm going to regret that, right? I didn't store or save any of that on in a folder that I know where it is. Let's keep this one. Let's keep this one. And let's not be too gutsy here. Let's go make sure we clear the selection. Okay, so we have this animation. And I want to do one more thing, if the system allows me. Maybe we'll do that another time. Alright, I'm running too many things here. I have a bunch of other animations going in the background. Still have some renderings. Oh, no, it's back. Okay, it was probably just swapping. Running close to out of memory, but still operational. So what I'll do is, well, let's first save that. That will be a DWA under here under potpourri, and that's our tunnel. I think that's tunnel 10, tutorial sequence 10, or part number 10. That's a 10A, and that'll be DWA. I'll convert it to AVI later. So what we want to do is have one more thing here, and that's to animate some sort of a piece of text. And the piece of text that I'm talking about is also going to have a little bit of a shadow drop, and it's going to have a white border around it. So this is a really interesting trick to know. I'm going to use a text tool. And with the text tool, first of all, you need to say what is the text. Okay. Let's say honk if you liked this tutorial. There you go. I hope you're not in a car while you're watching this, so obviously you won't be able to honk, but it sounds fun, so let's do that. Let's go make it centered. Let's make it a bigger, so click on F for the font lister, and the font lister has a size control here. Let's make it also a different font, something a little bit more presentable. Do we have a bold mode? Yeah, that's good. Okay, let's use that. And or even more. No, I want something that's really kind of like stencil. I like stencil. Let's use that. Honk if you liked this tutorial. Okay, so let's go keep that. And what I'll do is I'll convert this to an image, right? As a brush, actually. Make brush. Now, when I do that, it's going to have the black parts here and the white background, because we have black for primary color and white for secondary color. That part is going to be transparent. Now maybe I don't want the text to be black. Let's make the primary color kind of a purplish, what's that, a magenta, not magenta, whatever that color is. I'm going to use that. It's a relatively dark color. The background, the secondary color is white. And we could have it the other way, it doesn't matter. Let's use that. Let's make that the brush. So now we have a brush, custom preview. There you go. You can see it. And you see a little bit of whiteness to it. Let me zoom in. You can see a little bit of whiteness on the anti-aliased edges. All right. I want to increase that. How do I do that? It's transparent around it. Let's store that so we can see it. When I brush, store, and manage a copy from the brush, you can see it's got this plaid pattern behind it, which is the universal sign that we have a transparent behavior, and we see the plaid pattern behind it. But we want larger white edges all around it. And so here's how you do that. You look under the brush transparency. No, excuse me. Yeah, no, under transparency right there. Go to the bottom, there's key grow and key shrink. What's the key? That's the color key. And since white was the background color that it keyed on, we can simply increase that, and it's going to grow it to the outside, or shrink it, make it smaller. Right? So let's do that once, and sure enough, we already have a little bit more white. Let's go, in fact, let's use a shortcut. There is a keyboard shortcut for that. Let's see, what was it? Brush, transparency. It's the curly brace. Key grow, closing, right curly brace will grow it. Okay, let me use the shift and right curly, nothing. Maybe I need to get my keyboard focus. Click on it once, and there you go. Okay, every time I click, it does that. And maybe I can go the other way and make it a little bit tighter, but that can actually start looking non-linear. Anyway, so we have this. Let's make that our brush. store that, and then add a little shadow to that. A shadow drop is always nice, adds some clarity to it. So brush, add a shadow drop, there it is, and you can see a little preview here, more fuzzy, more opaque, and there you go. So we now have actually that shadow drop right in the brush with a nice soft alpha transition. And let's store that. That's a good brush to use. In fact, that's a brush you might want to store even in the browse media. But what I'm going to do with it is even better. What I'm going to do is to animate this text. So we want that text to appear at the very end, right? So here we go. Let's go to the animation, brush keyframer. And what do we do with that? We animate it, right? But we don't want to see it at the beginning. We want to see it at the very end. Right? So during this part here, we don't want to see it. Well, let's just either move it aside or have it come in with a zero opacity, make it fully transparent. In fact, you could have that animated alpha, and it would appear from the side. It would come in and it would render it only where it's actually seen. That would be a really cool way to do it. Let's see if we can do that. Alright, so let's go and re-enable the alpha. Do I still have it? I think I did not delete it. Shame on me if I did. There it is. Let's use that as the animated selection. And so we do have the animated selection. Let's make sure we see it, because right now it's turned off. Show marching hands. Yep, here they are. So we know we can render this brush going across, and then relatively small. We'll have it smaller going across and then come towards us at the end. All right, so let's do that. Animation, brush keyframer. There you are. And you see there's definitely some alpha action or some sort of behavior with the alpha channel there. And what I'll do is make it, let's say, make it smaller. Motion blur, align path, let's go. I want it about this small, and I want it to come in from the side here. Alright, so it will be like this, perhaps a little bit smaller. There. And it'll be up here in the upper left corner. Initially invisible though, so let's make it zero opacity on the first, actually even all the way to that. So let's keyframe it there, and then go all the way to the beginning and keyframe it to the same values. So there is no change. It will force it that way. Now we turn the visibility on, the opacity, right? And we'll also start moving it down a little bit, like this much, and keyframe that. And then we'll go to about here. We'll be in the middle. Maybe we'll rotate it too. Let's tumble. Something like that. And now it's time to start bringing it closer. So now we can tumble it back, perhaps just a little bit, not the full turn, just to have it a little bit like this, and start bringing it closer, like it's entering the other end of the tunnel there. And let's see what else. The animation continues, and we have the angle rotate one more time a little bit, and the size goes like that. There, maybe we want to line it up like this. Okay, I think that's good enough. Let's save this last keyframe, and here's a sneak preview of what that animation looks like. You see how it's disappearing right there? Right, it's not going through there. Now we can have it in opaque mode for that. The brush itself can be in opaque mode, or it could be in some other modes. It could be multiply mode, it could be greater than screen mode. There's all sorts of really fun effects with that. The XR mode, so you can always see it. Divide. Ooh, that looks interesting. Look at that. Alright, well, let's just keep it simple. Let's do an opaque mode and render that puppy. Let's go. So a lot of stuff happening here, and I think that's it. Let's go and watch this final animation. Let's clear the selection. Let's disable the alpha. There you go. No more alpha there. And nice little transition of the animation. And I'm never done. Let's do one more thing, which is a little bit of blur, not motion blur now, mind you. Something like photographic soft contrast improvement. That's too much. Let's give the level a little bit, something like that. No, let's give it. Oh, I know. Light diffusion. There you go. And shame on me for not even thinking about it. We should also add some sort of a bright light source somewhere, right? A big glow. So that will be perhaps something we can do in the next tutorial. Alright, well, thanks for watching. This was a nice, I think it was a great exercise to do all these different tutorials on tunnels, because there are so many different types of tunnels and so many things you can do beyond it and combine all that. So thanks again for watching. Have fun howling and waffling with Project Dog Waffle 9.2b.